The thing about reading the Torah in a triennial cycle is that, and why we do it, is so that we can't ignore any of it. Do you know what I mean? If you're always reading just the first third of the Torah portion through the year, or just paying attention to the same nice verses that we have or we can find, sometimes we have to look harder for them. But the triennial cycle, which is to say, instead of reading the entire Torah portion every year, the triennial cycle, which actually has its roots in ancient Palestine, so it has ancient roots, is that actually to fully really understand it, you should only read a third of the Torah portion each week. And it's a triennial cycle because it takes you 3 years to actually cover all of it. I hope that I explained that pretty well. So generally, and this is somewhat unique, it's not unique for our congregation, but it wasn't always this way in the Reform movement. Rabbi Herman can back me up, Cantor Gerber can back me up on this, but this idea of having really greater literacy, because we're focusing on different parts of it in this 3-year cycle, actually allows us to talk about the things that we might not talk about all the time, right? Because if I said we're just at this beginning of this Torah portion and we got to read how, Sarah's gonna become a mother, and well, that sounds familiar because we read that not too long ago on Rosh Hashanah, just seeing if anybody's awake out there. Yes, they're awake. But it's amazing that we don't necessarily, because of actually how we read just the story of Abraham and the sacrifice on Rosh Hashanah, and on day 2 we tend to read the story of creation. We actually don't really talk about Hagar and Ishmael. I've been thinking about Hagar and Ishmael a lot this past year for obvious reasons, but also because in the prayer for the redemption of the captives that we read, and I think it might even be in your prayer handout today, Cantor, page 2. Always trust her for the page numbers. You'll notice that there is a phrase here about asking for, in the third to last line of the second paragraph on page 2, grant strength of spirit and courage of heart to all the sons and daughters of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Does anybody notice that we say that? What are we saying? We're actually drawing our attention back to this core story that because we're reading the third part of it now, we're in the 3rd year of our triennial cycle, we're actually looking at this story of the birth of Ishmael and the role of Hagar. Now, Hagar is a very, very interesting character, and she shares something in common with the Jewish people clearly, because she too, her name actually means the stranger or the one who dwells there. And in last week's Torah portion, we saw something really pretty dramatic and awful happen, which is that she becomes pregnant, and Sarah, who's infertile, becomes jealous of her. Does everybody remember who Hagar is? I should probably stop and say, right? Abraham and Sarah, the ones who were called to in last week's Torah portion, go out and become a great nation. The only problem was they had no offspring, even though they were promised. There were no offspring. Eventually, they give up hope, kind of, which is an important part of the story. And Sarah encourages Abraham to take on a co-wife. Well, that's a nice way of putting it. A concubine, or a surrogate, a co-wife, to perhaps bring him offspring that he was promised. She becomes pregnant. Sarah gets very jealous and is very cruel to her, and she runs away. That could have been the end of the story, right? And then later we'll find out that it's okay because Isaac is going to appear and our story continues. But actually God says, no, your story's not over. Your offspring too, Ishmael, is going to become a great nation. So she goes back, she has the child, things become even more difficult. Does this sound like a TV drama? I mean, who needs TV when you have this? The tension between them. So actually, they end up, Sarah with this little baby Ishmael, gets sent out into the desert without adequate supplies. Now, we know that they know that this is what we do really with the goats on Yom Kippur. What do? We send out the goats to the desert, and one of them, and what do we know? With the scapegoats. Is anybody awake at this point on Yom Kippur? Lech la'azazel, which if I were saying that in modern Hebrew, I would have just told you all to go to hell. But no, that's what the Torah says. When you send something out into the desert like that, it really means being sent to certain death. So there they are, Hagar and this baby, out in the desert. And God saying to Abraham along the way, don't worry, it's all going to turn out right. But when they send them out to the desert, they could have just turned away, returned to the tent, and said to each other, well, that's that. Now on with our story. Wouldn't that have been so much more convenient? It would have been. But actually, what the Torah keeps drawing us back to last week and this week is that we are not the only people in the story. It is not all about us. And then we get a description of what happens to them. Let's not worry about the two people's narrative here, which is an ongoing narrative to this very day. What I want to look at for these few moments is actually what happens for Hagar in the desert with her baby. Wouldn't it be great to not really know too much about that? Doesn't that sound like a horrific situation? Right? Whenever we think about all the immigrant mothers as we speak, or at any time in history, who have gone out, who have been forced out of a safe place and been forced to seek shelter. At some point in this dramatic story, we are taught something about never giving up and about patience, which is what I wrote about, except guess what? Sometimes people give up. And sometimes it is perfectly understandable that even a parent might need to turn their gaze away from this baby who's dying in the desert. And that could have also been the end of the story, right? Look how horrible she is. Now on with our story. But actually, God shows up for them. God doesn't let the fact that Hagar had given up and had lost hope and had lost faith and couldn't stand the situation that she was in, God doesn't allow that to be the end of the story. God actually turns to Hagar and says, even though you have turned away from your child, which in most of history and in most texts is like enough to just shun that character away into the past, God hears the cry of the boy. God hears the cry of that boy and sends an angel who calls out to Hagar from the heaven and says to her, I love this part, what troubles you, Hagar? What troubles you? It's a conversation. It's not a do not give up or you've done wrong. What troubles you? Fear not, for God has heeded the cry of the boy from where he is, ba'asher hu sham, where he is. God is going to meet you and this child where they are, in their place and time of need. And then, instead of going and, right, God could have, I suppose, just saved the child. Why did he need Hagar anymore? God says to Hagar, let me lead you back to him. Here's what you need to do. Go back in there, lift up the boy, hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Even though she'd given up, even though she turned away, God could still show up for her. So God guides Hagar back to her son, teaching her how to be with him, even in this moment to be able to see the future. And to quote one of my colleagues, Rabbi Tali Adler, she understands it as teaching all of us that God is the one who understands human frailty, maternal fear. How many of us have had these moments of fear? God becomes the one who will sit with the mother, with the child, in that hospital bed, in that desert, even if the mother needs to take a break for a moment, even if the person who needs to take care is not able to for a moment, but God will be there with them. Our God is the God of every mother who has ever flinched, of every caretaker who thought they just couldn't do it anymore. God is there with each one of us, even when we do give up, even when we do have to turn away. God is with us even when we no longer believe. Even when we no longer believe, God still believes in us. Most of us have probably had these moments when we have failed, perhaps failed to have hope, failed to have faith, failed to believe that a situation could possibly get better. Perhaps we failed in relationships in one way or another. But God teaches us that even that giving up hope and even those failures, that's not the end of the story. On those days, God's love for us is not dependent on our strength. God is with us even in those moments, even when we have given up, even when we have walked away. God will be with us when we are ready to teach us how to walk back in to those relationships, to those moments, and to teach us how to hold the hands of our loved ones, how to hold the hands of others in our congregation, how to hold the hands of the people we need to build relationships with in our city, in our country. God is with us saying that we can do it. We can walk back in. We can hold each other up again together. Shabbat Shalom.